Receptors are transducers that convert various forms of energy into action potential and nerve impulses. Sensory system starts with receptors. Information about various internal and external environment reaches the nervous system via various receptors. Sensory receptors may be part of neuron or specialized cell that can generate action potential in afferent neuron. Receptors along with surrounding non-neural cells is called sense organs. There are basically 5 types of receptors. They can be classified into mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, electromagnetic receptors, and chemoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors, where they are sensitive to mechanical compression and stretching of the receptors, and for example, tactile receptors, Pacinian corpuscles, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organ, proprioceptors, etc. Whereas thermoreceptors, they detect the changes in the warm and cold temperature in the skin. Whereas nociceptors, they detect damages occurring in the tissues like pain. Then electromagnetic receptors, for example, rods and cones. Chemoreceptors, for example, receptors of taste and smell. And carotid body and aortic body chemoreceptors, and chemoreceptors in hypothalamus, osmoreceptors in hypothalamus are the example for chemoreceptors. These are some of the touch receptors, Raffin's endings, Merkel's discs, Pacinian corpuscles. They are sensitive to various types of touch, and Pacinian corpuscles, they are also sensitive for vibration. Even Meissner's corpuscle is sensitive for touch. Free nerve endings carries different other sensation, including touch sensation, pain, temperature. Crosses and root hair plexuses, they are be useful in the detection of the movement. Some of the properties of receptors. First one is adequate stimulus. Receptors in each of these sense organs are adapted to respond to one particular form of energy at the lower threshold than the receptors respond to this form of energy, which is called as adequate stimulus. For example, touch or tactile receptors, light for uh, rods and cones. Second property is receptor or generator potential. Whatever be the strength of stimulus that excites the receptor, its immediate effect is to change the membrane electrical potential of the receptor. The receptor converts mechanical energy into electrical response called sensory transduction. Small depolarizing potential developed in receptor is called as a receptor or generator potential. It is a non-propagated local graded potential, that is, the magnitude is proportional to the strength of stimulus and it does not obey all or none law. It depolarizes the first node of Raniware. Once the firing level reached, an action potential is developed and is propagated. If the receptor potential is great enough, the neuron fires again and again soon as it repolarizes, and it continues to fire as long as the generator potential is at threshold level of excitation. Thus, node converts graded response of receptor potential into action potential. The frequency of action potential in the sensory nerve is proportional to the strength of stimulus. Mechanism of generation of generator potential. The basic cause of receptor potential is change in membrane permeability. This is explained below by taking a case of Pacinian corpuscle. In Pacinian corpuscle, the central fibers are surrounded by capsule of multiple layer of connective tissue. Compression anywhere in the capsule deform the membrane of the nerve fiber. The tip of the nerve which is inside in the capsule is demyelinated. The first node of Raniware is there inside the capsule. The ionic basis of local potential will be when compression of the capsule occurs, nerve endings are deformed and sodium channels open, which causes depolarization and receptor potential is generated. Then it is going to summate to produce action potential in the first node of Raniware and it will be propagated along the sensory nerve fibers. The third property is adaptation. When sustained stimulus of constant strength is applied, the frequency of action potential in its sensory nerve declines gradually. Based on the degree, there are two types of adaptation, that is rapidly adapting. For example, touch receptors are rapidly adapting ones, and slowly adapting. For example, pain receptors, chemoreceptors, baroreceptors, or stretch receptors, they are slowly adapting type. Fourth property is intensity discrimination or sensory coding. Information about intensity of stimulus, for example, whether the touch is fine or crude, to the brain is transmitted by two mechanisms. One is by variation in the frequency of action potential generated in the sensory nerve. This depends on the magnitude of the receptor potential. As receptor potential increases, the frequency of action potential increases. Second one is by variation of the number of receptors stimulated. According to the Weber-Fechner's law, magnitude of sensation is felt proportional to the logarithm of intensity of stimulus. The formula is given like S is equal to K into the log of intensity of stimulus plus C, where K and C are the constants. The fifth law is labeled line principle. In normal course, a touch or pain or temperature receptor is connected to specific series of neurons which carry the message up to the cerebral cortex where it is interpreted. It is interesting to question whether the perceived modality of stimulus depends on the receptor or the pathway through which it travels. But the modality actually depends upon the pathway itself. To understand better, let us consider an example. If a retina were connected to the auditory nerve, the stimulation of the retina by light would evoke a sensation of sound. That is, we could be able to hear a torch. This concept of modality being dependent on the pathway has been termed as labeled line principle. This is the pathway are labeled as touch lines, temperature lines, etc. Thus, labeled sensory channels consist of a set of neurons devoted to carry a particular sensory modality. The sixth one is Muller's doctrine of specific nerve energy. Nerve fibers transmit only nerve impulses or action potential, but we experience different sensation. For example, action potential produced in a nerve fiber from a thermoreceptor is identical to that produced in tactile receptor. There are separate pathways for each sensation. Each nerve track terminate at a specific point in CNS. The type of sensation felt when the nerve fiber is stimulated is determined by the point in the nervous system, that is in the cortex, and where these fibers end in the cortex. When the nerve pathway from particular sense organ is stimulated, the sensation is produced for which the receptor is specialized, no matter how or where along the pathway it is stimulated. So this principle is called as Muller's doctrine of specific nerve energy. For example, if the sensory nerve from Pacinian corpuscle in the hand is stimulated by pressure at the elbow or by irritation from the tumor in the brachial plexus, the sensation evoked is touch. Then the seventh is law of projection. If we stimulate anywhere in the pathway, the sensation produced is projected to the area where the receptors are located. This is called as law of projection. This explains the phantom limb phenomena. Phantom limb, if a person's limb is amputated, ends of the nerve cut at the time of amputation form nerve tangles or neuromas, and these are hypersensitive. These neuromas are stimulated with a minimum stimulus or discharge, or they discharge spontaneously. This generates impulses in the nerve fiber that previously came from the receptor in the removed limb, and the sensation produced are projected to where the receptors used to be located.